Yes, very, very nice to be with you all here this weekend. Very nice to see some familiar faces and very nice to see some new faces as well. So I will be talking today about the way of the compassionate hero, which is the Bodhisattva. The compassionate hero, the hero of compassion, is the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva in Buddhist tradition is this figure who practices not for their own salvation, or not just for their own salvation, but for the benefit and the sake of all living beings whatsoever. Their interest, they have the broadest possible perspective on what it is to lead a Buddhist life. Their goal is not to gain enlightenment for themselves, but what's said often is that they delay enlightenment, that they delay their own release, their own liberation. And this isn't to be taken too literally, but they delay their own liberation so that they can help all other living beings out of the realm of samsara, the realm of rebirth, into enlightenment, into liberation. So that in a sense what they do is they sacrifice themselves for all living beings. And of course this is the quintessential act of the hero, isn't it? Is sacrifice, is self-sacrifice, to sacrifice yourself, to endure pain or to endure loss for the sake of others. This is what it is to be a hero, isn't it? And of course the Bodhisattva, then in that regard, since they are willing to sacrifice themselves for all living beings, is in a sense the Buddhist hero or the compassionate hero. So as so often with these talks, if you're if maybe others who do talks on a regular basis will know this, that so often if you're giving a talk on a topic, if you're careful and you watch your experience, you'll find the world will sort of tee it up for you, will kind of give you something that allows you into the talk, to explore the talk. And so it has been with this talk as well. So I'll relay a little bit of a experience I had recently in this whole area of heroicism and compassion. So I recently walked the West Highland Way. Some of you who are into hiking will know about it. An amazing walk, absolutely phenomenal walk. It starts outside Glasgow, a little bit outside Glasgow, in a town called Milgahy, and it goes about 100 miles up along Loch Lomond, past Loch Lomond into the Munros, through Glen Nevis, and then finishes in Fort William, 100 miles down the way. And I was blessed with weather, and it was a really beautiful walk. So I really encourage anybody who wants to do it to do it. They told me that the midges were not out in late May. They lied. They were out in late May, and in quite some force as well at times as well. So that was the only slight downer on that particular trip. But I remember one day as I was walking, I think it was maybe the second, third day or something like that, and that is so characteristic of me. I had completely miscalculated the sort of distance that I had to walk, and how sort of capable or physically able I would be able to walk that distance. And on the third day, I think I've got 20 miles to walk or something like that, and I've walked 20 miles the day before with a 15 kilo sack on my back as well, and I'm not feeling very happy. I'm predominantly grumpy at this point. I'm not taking in the beautiful surroundings, the beautiful aura of Loch Lomond. I'm predominantly telling off others around me and getting grumpy with others around me and myself. And my experience isn't, you could say, very sort of expansive or positive. Anyway, just as I come along, and I'm sort of just about to hit kind of midway point, I come to this clearing in the trail just along the loch, and there's a plaque, and the plaque says, "In memory of Bill Lomond, who made the ultimate sacrifice in giving his life for a friend." So, in memory of Bill Lomond, who made the ultimate sacrifice in giving his life for a friend. And in front of that plaque was a sort of tower of sticks and sort of of sticks that had been sort of just piled up in front and pebbles all around the memorial, where people had been sort of come across the memorial, been so sort of clearly moved by this sacrifice. It doesn't say what happened. Actually, what happened was Bill Lomond was walking along the loch with, he was a university lecturer at the University of Glasgow, I believe, and was walking along the loch with some colleagues and the students one day, and the rainfall must have been heavier than they expected, and one of his colleagues, in fact two of his colleagues, got swept up in this stream that they misjudged, and Bill Lomond went in to save them, was able to save them. Father of two, was able to save them, but gave his life, the ultimate act of self-sacrifice in doing so. And of course, what an act of love. What an incredible act of love. The Bible says there's no other love than to give one's life for a friend. There is no higher love than to give one's life for a friend. An incredible sort of sacrifice. And people obviously clearly sort of thought so. This act of heroicism had moved people as they come along, because all in front of the memorial was this tower of sticks that had been put and collected from around the area, and all these pebbles and stones that had been put around the memorial as offerings to this, as acts of reverence, in fact, to this act of heroicism, this act of compassionate heroicism, this act of love of Bill Lomond giving his life to friends. And of course, I was moved by the act, and I was sort of immediately kind of taken out beyond my small kind of petty grumpiness, this kind of tight sort of mental state that I'd just inhabited and I'd been inhabiting, and immediately brought given a perspective much sort of broader than myself, but so clearly, and I was moved by this as well, but so clearly had others as well as they came along. And when I, of course, was moved to, of course, find my own offering, I couldn't leave without finding my own offering, so I put my bag down, and all around the whole area, I actually had to go quite some time, because all around the whole area had been cleared of pebbles and stones and sticks as people were moved by this act to make their own offering, and they wanted to as well. And I just imagined all of those sort of wary travellers just stopping, being moved by this act of love and just needing to make an offering to it. And I thought, of course I had to make my own offering, but I thought it strange, because so often, and thankfully we don't do this talk at Padmaloka, but some of you will have been to beginners retreats at various other centres, and you'll have got at the first night you'll have got I'm desperately sorry, but we're going to do a ritual talk. Yeah, that's not what we call it, but that's in between the lines. I'm desperately sorry, but we're going to do a ritual talk. And it usually goes something like, this isn't a God, don't worry, it's not a God, it's the highest potential in yourself. I'm really sorry, we're going to do a ritual. It's not a God, I'm really sorry, we do ritual in Buddhism. That's sort of the in between the lines talk. Yeah, we don't do this talk. If you did this talk in any traditional Buddhist country, they think it ridiculous. They think, no, don't be silly, we revere the Buddha. We look up to the Buddha, and we want to make offerings. And then you sort of have to get people to make offerings, and then some people react, and you have to try and manage their reaction, and then, there's all that sort of can happen. But I thought, here we go, look at this, the most natural thing in the world, to want to make offerings, to want to look up to that which is higher than ourselves, which transcends ourselves. All these people, many of whom I no doubt would have believed themselves to be atheists, and would have never have thought themselves as making an act of reverence or making an offering to an act of beauty or love, but that's exactly what they were doing, and they needed to do it. So the most natural thing in the world. So don't we need heroes? We need heroes, and we need people to look up to. We need people to revere. The Buddha was to say this on the dawn of his enlightenment. He knew that he was the highest thing. There was no other human that he could now look up to. There was no sense of false humility with the Buddha, and he thought it was painful. It's painful not to have something to look up to. So the Buddha looked up to the Dharma, the reality in itself. But for us, it's painful. That also is true. That psychological insight also is true, that it's painful not to have something to look up to, and we just immediately want to do it. So we need heroes. We need heroes for what they represent. And the Bodhisattva is the quintessential Buddhist hero. The Bodhisattva sacrifices themselves in love for all living beings. So when I was younger, I think I've always knew I sort of needed heroes. And when I was younger, I had many heroes. In fact, when I was younger, all my heroes had picked up a gun. Every single one of my heroes had picked up a gun when I was younger. So I remember when I was 13, 14, much to the sort of shock and appall of my mother, I had these great big massive posters in my room, and one was Che Guevara, and that amazing iconic image, the sort of long flowing locks, that romantic image taken by an Irishman, that photograph actually. We'll take any credit. Actually, Che Guevara himself is, not many people know, but his grandmother was from Galway. His middle name was Lynch, but it's true. And next to him was Malcolm X. Malcolm X, that the famous black rights activist during the civil rights era in the US, the founder of the Black Panthers, and that striking quote, some of you will know that striking quote that often goes with that famous image of Malcolm X. He's got the finger pointed like that, looking stern and defiant. And the quote is that they demand their rights as human beings, their dignity as human beings in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary. And usually at the end of that quote, you have the by any means necessary capitalized really for emphasis. And what a sort of strong, sort of striking, energetic quote, isn't it? There's so much I remember the first time reading it and seeing the image, just sort of this thrill kind of running through me, the energy of the statement and of the sort of the vision. And so I had many heroes when I was younger. All of them had picked up a gun. Now I don't think I'd sort of think of those men as my heroes today, but I would admire many of them, still. In the words of Margaret Thatcher when she was talking about Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker, Bobby Sands, she says, you don't need to agree with the politics of people or the means that they go about it to admire their courage. Margaret Thatcher was very admiring of Bobby Sands and his courage, but she obviously didn't agree. They were deep political foes, weren't they? They didn't obviously agree on each other's politics or the aims or the means that they sought to brought it about. So I still have admiration for those men, and I think partly the admiration is something of this sort of willingness to kind of serve something higher than yourself, and actually to be willing to pay the ultimate price for that, the ultimate sacrifice for that. And there is something actually in that quite close to the spiritual ideal, I think. In the willingness to die for something, there is something quite close to the spiritual ideal. In fact, there's something quite close, although in some ways far away as well, to the ideal of the Bodhisattva, the spiritual ideal of the Bodhisattva, which of course the Bodhisattva has started and sees through this delusion of the separateness of oneself and another, of this sort of self that we kind of protect and gather and progress through life, that we're so sort of protective and kind of tight around. Heroes start to see through that, don't they? Those that are willing to sacrifice their lives for something has started, on whatever sort of level, have started to see through that delusion of a distinct and separate self that we sort of hold so tightly to, and which they hold in sort of, in a sense, in common with the Bodhisattva. I've been reading recently one of the seminars from Bhante Sangharakshita, who founded the Triratna movement. I've been reading one of the old seminars, the Shepherd's Search for Mind, and the Shepherd's Search for Mind is stories from teachings from Milarepa, the famous Tibetan yogi. And in a lot of the Shepherd's Search for Mind, it's the teachings that he's give to his sort of troublesome and wayward disciple Ruchungpa, who gives him endless amounts of worry and stress, but is one of his greatest disciples. And he's talking to Rinpoche about the Mahamudra. And the Mahamudra is one of the highest teachings in Tibetan Buddhism. And Bhante is relating the teaching of Rinpoche to of Milepa to Rinpoche, and saying that it requires, so this is on the Mahamudra, it requires a man who disregards comfort and suffering. It requires the courage of fearlessness, the defiance of death. So the defiance of death, and Bhante was very, very strong on this, and particularly in this area of the Mahamudra. And I think what Bhante was trying to pour cold water on is sometimes this tendency that we can have to think that we're suddenly up to the highest of teachings, that we've gone beyond the metta bhavana, we've gone beyond the mindfulness of breathing, that we're now ready for the Mahamudra, we're ready for the big guns of Buddhism, that we're sort of prepared for that. And I think Bhante was keen to emphasize this particular, that it requires the defiance of death, to say, we should know where we're at. And maybe we're not quite ready for those particular teachings yet. But he said something I think very striking. Bhante said, the Mahamudra teaching is concerned with non-ego. The fear of death is fear of giving up self, of loss of ego. So unless you're willing to go beyond the fear of death, there is no point in going into Mahamudra. So in the Zen tradition, those who live close to death, even for worldly motives, are quite close to the spiritual life. So often you will have military people with a strong affinity for the spiritual life. So interesting, isn't it? Where you have those that are willing to sacrifice their life, even for worldly motives, and even sometimes for ideals that have been twisted, and maybe even sometimes ideals that have been poisoned. You do have some sort of resonance there with spiritual life, but I'll say a little bit more about that later. So the Bodhisattva is this archetype of the Buddhist hero, and they sacrifice themselves for all living beings. And one of the sort of quintessential stories of the Bodhisattva sacrifice for all living beings is Avalon Katashra, and he's on the shrine here. We met him last night, and I said a little about him last night. And the story of Avalon Katashra I'll relate in brief. So Avalon Katashra, before he becomes this figure, the four-armed or the thousand-armed figure of Avalon Katashra, is seated in meditation. And he gets a vision of all of the suffering of beings in the land of Tibet. He sees all of the suffering of beings in the land of Tibet. And of course then the world would have been on fire with suffering, as it is now. So much suffering in the world around us, isn't there? There's no end to suffering in the world around us. And Avalon Katashra saw this vision of all the beings in the land of Tibet suffering in that particular way, and he was moved. He was deeply moved. So what he did was he took a vow to reside in meditation, to dwell in meditation until he'd saved all the beings in the land of Tibet from suffering, till he delivered them all from suffering. He delivered them all into nirvana. And he made this vow that if he was to be distracted for one moment in this project of saving living beings, that he would shatter into 1,000 pieces. And so he does. He dwells in meditation for eons. And then at that point to him a thought comes that he'd sort of have a look at his progress, see how he's doing in terms of saving all living beings from suffering in the land of Tibet. And so he surveys again the situation, and again he sees that he has saved but a few living beings from suffering. He's only delivered a few living beings from suffering, and immediately he becomes despondent. A thought of despondency arises. And of course, because he's made a vow, he breaks into 1,000 pieces. And in his distress, he calls out to Amitabha and asks for help, asks for Amitabha to save him. And Amitabha puts him back together again in the form that you now see. So in the four-arm form, sometimes depicted in the thousand-arm form as well. And he's given 11 heads to survey the 11 directions of the world with Amitabha his head on the very top. So this is often the figure that you'll see sometimes in art form or in rupa form, this 1,000-arm figure of Avalon Katashra, each arm being a hand that goes out into the world to help living beings, to save living beings from suffering. But the heroic elements, and of course that is a hero story, isn't it? Being willing to sacrifice yourself. Avalon Katashra is a hero in that regard. But that tradition of self-sacrifice and heroism has gone all the way through the Buddhist tradition. If you look through to the Jataka tales, for example, the Jataka tales were stories of the Buddha prior to his the lifetime that he achieved enlightenment. Sort of folk tales, you could say, some of which became canonical, some of which became sort of officialized, if you get me. And but many of which were in the folklore of India at the time, and the character of the Buddha was sort of inserted into these stories. But many of these Jataka tales emphasized the Buddha's willingness to sacrifice himself all the way down through these lives. So often he would have been, often he wasn't a human being, many times he was a human being, but often he came back as a monkey or a bird or a lion. And so many of the tales emphasize his willingness to sacrifice himself. So one of the famous ones, he feeds himself to a hungry tigress because her and her cubs haven't eaten for weeks. So this story of heroism goes right back. Of course, one of the most, I think, probably well-known images of Buddhist heroism that we know today is the image of, it's called the image of the burning monk, the image of Thich Quang Duc. And maybe it's fortuitous, actually, that we bring Thich Quang Duc to mind, actually, this weekend, because as it happens, it's the 60th anniversary of his death tomorrow. He died tomorrow, 60 years ago to the day, and many people will know this particular image of Thich Quang Duc. He's known as the burning monk. Some people think that he died in protest of the Vietnam War, but actually it was in protest of the South Vietnamese, the French colonial South Vietnamese government cracking down on the local Buddhist community in South Vietnam at the time. And many of you will know this image. He set himself alight on a busy crossroads in Saigon and sat there and burnt for 10 minutes before slowly slumping over and dying. But what an incredible image. I mean, many of you will know the image. The photographer got it, who spoke about taking the image later, said he didn't flinch. And if you ever see the image, you'll see almost this perfectly serene face as these flames just go up around him, completely not moving. The photographer who took it said he didn't make a sound. What an incredible sacrifice to make, and reverberated around the world. People were moved by that image around the world, and I think it was Kennedy said that never before had an image garnered so much emotion and feeling as that particular photo. And of course, what happened was that the South Vietnamese government, the French colonial South Vietnamese government at the time, were actually forced to stop cracking down on the local Buddhist communities. A very, very oppressive regime, Catholic regime at the time, and were forced to stop on the basis of this heroic self-sacrifice of Thich Quang Duc. And I think it's a good example, actually, because so often those sort of acts of self-sacrifice can be done from the wrong place. They can come from the wrong place, and they can be motivated for the wrong thing. And people, I was talking to Deva Mitra about Thich Quang Duc not long ago, and he was very, very keen to emphasize that this wasn't an act of despair by Thich Quang Duc. It wasn't an act of hatred either by Thich Quang Duc. It wasn't a protest and antagonism to anybody else. That what it was an act of love, that it was an offering as an act of love. And of course, that's what makes Buddhist self-sacrifice a Buddhist self-sacrifice, that it's done on the basis of love and of the concern for all living beings, not done in antagonism to any other group of living beings at all. And of course, we know that ideals can be picked up the wrong way, can't they? So often the Buddha talks about this in the metaphor of the water snake. He said if you have a water snake, you have to be very, very skilled, and you want to pick it up. You have to be very, very skilled in the way that you pick it up. You have to pick it up in the right way. If you don't pick it up in the right way, it can bite you. And we see that with ideals, don't we, so often, that there's a certain ideal there, but they get picked up in the wrong way. And this has no doubt been the case with Buddhist ideals as well. You only need to look at, say, for example, in that teaching of emptiness of self, so often has been used in the Zen tradition, in fact, has been used during World War II as a way of justifying killing innocent beings, because those innocent beings, according to this justification, this completely false justification, are empty of self, and so you're not really killing a living being. Of course, that is an ideal completely picked up from the wrong end and turned totally sort of poisonous, isn't it? So we must be very, very careful about how we pick up our ideals. Sometimes they can go very, very wrong. We have to, of course, have ideals, but of course we have to hold them in a very, very particular way, and the Buddha really emphasized that as well. I remember when I lived very, very briefly in Palestine and in Gaza, and if you walk into the old town of Gaza, you will see these huge, big, massive images, a bit like we'd have sort of billboards with consumer goods on them. It's interesting what you make your heroes, don't you? We put these massive images of consumer goods. In Gaza, you'll get these huge images of young men who have blown themselves up in suicide attacks targeting Israel, sometimes the military, sometimes innocent civilians, and very, very eerie images. You know, often you'll have these young men strapped up with the Semtex that they'll use probably the day after the photo is taken, very close to the time, to blow themselves up, with a Quran in one hand and a Kalashnikov in another. Very, very eerie images, because you know they're soon to go to their death, but they're soon to go to their death in an ideal that's become completely twisted and sometimes completely poisonous. This isn't me judging those young men. Often those young men have been broken by the circumstances of that particular conflict. So in distinction from somebody like Thich Nhat Hanh or the Bodhisattva, who does this act of self-sacrifice out of love, so many of these young men would have been chosen and actually groomed because they'd been broken by the conflict. Maybe their own family, whole family sometimes, might have been taken unjustly, killed unjustly, and they'd been sort of broken and driven to despair. And in fact, they were suicidal on that basis, and that's how they do it. That's why they do it, and they'd be chosen for that basis and groomed for that basis to do it. So the Buddha's sacrifice, Thich Nhat Hanh's sacrifice, comes from a very, very different place. It doesn't come in antagonism or in hatred towards anybody, but comes out of a place of love and a desire to help. But we must be careful about our ideals, and of course we must be careful about the ideal of heroicism as well, because it can go so wrong, can't it? I mean, in the introduction, good God, what's your name again? Dharma Shalin, sorry, this is a poem. Mindfulness fail. Dharma Shalin sort of introduced this idea of the hero, and can often be so sort of arrogant, can't it? The hero can be often sort of an arrogant and kind of very sort of inflated, self-inflated. So it's a very, very easy sort of ideal to pick up in the wrong way. But I think these qualities of sort of self-sacrifice and heroicism do actually have an affinity with each other in Buddhism. They are very close, and in fact, they're both of the sort of the active element. They're both in the kind of they're both sort of they're both of a kind of an active masculine quality. You see this actually in the Yab Yom figures in Tibetan iconography. Sometimes you'll see them. You have the sort of the male Buddha and his female consort, and they're they're unified in this sort of this sexual embrace, or what we describe as a sexual embrace. Of course, the Tibetans wouldn't view it in that way. They don't think it has anything to do with sex. For us, it looks sexual, but the male figure in this particular duo of or combination of the male and the female Buddha, it often stands for compassion. And the female figure, the female consort, stands for wisdom. And that's because compassion in the Buddhist tradition is the active element. It's the element that goes out, that steps into the world, and that wants to help, that wants to intervene. The female consort often stands for wisdom in this much more receptive sense. It's a sort of passive quality, passive not in a pejorative sense, but in a very, very positive sense in terms of a receptive sense, but stands for wisdom. And actually the male figure, the male Buddha or Bodhisattva, stands for intervention in the world, agency in the world, helping in the world, and wanting to step in and alleviate the suffering of those around him and of all living beings. And similarly, again, if you have the image of Vajrasattva, Vajrasattva holds the Vajra to his heart and holds the bell as well. And the Vajra is the symbol of compassion and power. And the bell stands for wisdom. And the Vajra is said to be masculine, the bell feminine. And so you've got these sort of quite close sort of correlation between heroicism, activity, masculinity, and compassion within the Buddhist tradition. And maybe actually sometimes that might even go a little bit distinct from the way that we think of sort of stereotypical gender roles, don't we? We often think of men as more in the sort of the wise, and the female as more as the compassionate. But here's Tibetan Buddhism saying, no, the compassionate is the active and the masculine element of Buddhism. And so as above, so below. We see this, don't we, in the world. I was recently reading a book. It was called Of Boys and Men, and it's a book that sort of is looking at the situation that men face in the world, the challenges that men face in the world. And in the book, the author, whose name completely escapes me, describes this situation, how often so many of the masculine qualities are disregarded, are sort of dismissed. So often masculinity is talked about much more in terms of what's wrong with it and toxicity and all of these things. And so often what's positive and beautiful about the masculine is often sort of dismissed or not looked at. And he says, well, look, in 2021, you've got the Carnegie Hero Fund, which recognizes self-sacrifice by heroes every year. And he said in 2021, 66 of the 71 of those awards were given to men. 66 of the 71 of those awards given to men, including a 19-year-old man who was killed attempting to lead a 3-year-old from a fire, including a 17-year-old young man who was drowned after saving a 9-year-old boy and his mother. And of course, you won't hear these stories. You tune into the BBC, you won't hear these stories. You won't hear those men being celebrated in that way, but here we are in 2021, 66 of the 71 awards for heroism went to men. So of course there's a natural affinity, I think, in the world, and certainly in Buddhist thinking, between compassion, activity, masculinity, and heroism. They go hand in hand. I think it's very, very important as well to remember, actually, when we're thinking of compassion, to remember the active element, to remember that it's an active thing, an active desire to want to help. It's not sentimental. So often we can think of sort of compassion as just this private sort of feeling of sentimentality, this sort of private kind of feeling of being depressed or moved by the world. The more depressed that we get at a desperate situation, the more sort of compassionate we are, according to our own sort of sentimental kind of take on it. So we often think of it that it's enough to have some sort of private kind of feeling of melancholy, and to quote whatever sort of fashionable opinion comes from that private feeling of melancholy at the appropriate time, and therefore we are compassionate. But the Buddhist tradition would say no. That compassionate is a very, very strong desire to intervene in the world. And in fact, in early Buddhism, I was reading an article by Analayo recently, in early Buddhist thought, the feeling of karuna, or compassion, karuna is the Sanskrit term for compassion, and is one of the Brahma Viharas, one of the divine abodes in Buddhist thinking. But the feeling of karuna would arise on a feeling of joy, because it would be a desire to intervene in the world, and the understanding that one could intervene in the world to do something better, to help other living beings, and that what would arise of that was a feeling of hope, was a feeling of joy. It was a sense that you could intervene. And of course, karuna, the Karuna Bhavana, is one of the significant meditations of the Brahma Viharas. And we come, if you get an opportunity, I'd really encourage people to come to Padmaloka and do the Brahma Viharas retreat. And the Karuna Bhavana is one of the meditations that you'll do. And of course, for that to be a meditation that gives rise to concentration and depth, it needs to have a sense of joy to it, doesn't it? It needs to have a sense of the capacity to be able to intervene where people suffer. It can't be one of desperation and despair, which is so often how we think of sort of compassion, because of course you're not going to develop any depth of concentration or meditation in that regard. So the desire to intervene, so important in Buddhist thinking. It was interesting, I don't know, if just to sort of make a current example of that, if people have seen this latest thing with Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby on the morning show. And of course, Philip Schofield has got himself into a touch of trouble. And Holly Willoughby, in her first sort of show back, said, because Philip Schofield has gone, he got in trouble for sleeping with a younger colleague. There was never any sense of anything illegal or anything about it, but he got in trouble with sleeping with a younger colleague, and he got kicked off the show. And Holly Willoughby on her first show back said, "Firstly, are you okay?" And of course, she's been completely hounded for this ridiculous statement, as if we were all sort of deeply traumatized by the sex life of Philip Schofield. I mean, of course we're not. It's like, no, yes, we're fine, come on. Holly, don't worry about it, get on with it. But as if we sort of, this kind of like, as if something, somebody's sex life would suddenly kind of leave us all sort of deeply traumatized in some sort of way. And that is the way that sometimes now we think of compassion, as being sort of a delicate and easily sort of knocked over feeling that makes us more and more sort of limp in a certain way. So this offering oneself for the sake of all living beings, this offering of oneself to intervene in the world, to help others suffering. Of course, we're not all going to get the opportunity for such grand actions, such massive actions as giving one's life, particularly in giving one's life in death for a particular ideal. But I think for me, actually, when I joined the order, when I joined the Triratna Buddhist order, when I was given that ordination, what was communicated to me before I joined the order is that when you join the order, your life is no longer your own. When you join the order, your life is no longer your own. You give up your life in that sort of private sense. It doesn't belong to you in that particular way anymore. It's then part of a much broader common project, a project that you hold with your brothers and sisters in the order. And if, say, for example, one is thinking of what to do, if I'm thinking of what to do with my life, what's very, very important is that decision is no longer mine to make in and of itself. Of course, my opinion on it will be important. It is my life. Well, it's not my life, but in that sort of way, my opinion will be important on it. But it will be incredibly important that I talk to my teachers, my friends, my mentors in the Dharma and say, okay, well, where can I best be used? Because my life ideally is not my own anymore. Where can I best be used? And this is the life that you enter into when you join the order, that your life is actually not yours. It's not for our own personal wants or our personal pleasures or to avoid inconveniences that we don't want to do, but belongs to the order. And so we give it up and give up those sort of wants and preferences for where can I best be used. Similarly, say for example, it's said that when you join the order that you no longer have a private life in that particular way. There's no particular area where a fellow order member can't come up to you and say, well, what about that? And you can say, well, that's none of your business. Those words don't belong in the order. Your whole life is the business of your brethren in the order, and you have to be able to talk about it. So when you join the order, your life is no longer yours in that particular way. And that's right at the heart of our ordination vows, actually. If you join the Triratna Buddhist order, and some of you will be training to join the Triratna Buddhist order, right at the heart of our Buddhist vows is, for the sake of all living beings, I accept this ordination. For the sake of all living beings, I accept this ordination. So that is the Bodhisattva vow. The Bodhisattva vow is right at the heart of the ordination that you take when you join the Triratna Buddhist order, and what that means is that your life is no longer your own in that particular way. And I think for me, the order has been a context where I can look to just serve a higher ideal, where I can just offer my life up, not in death. That's not open to me, and hopefully it won't ever be. Actually, I quite like my life, but through my life. I can offer up my life, the whole of my life, through my life to something higher. And I think this is where the order really thrives, actually, and this is where I see order members really thriving. Bhante said that the order was one of the arms of the 1,000-armed Avalon Katashra. So Sangharakshita says this, that the order in its ideal form is one of the arms, mythically is one of the arms in the 1,000-armed Avalon Katashra. So it's one of the arms that reaches into the world, that looks to alleviate the suffering of the world, that heroically looks to alleviate the suffering of the world, that puts its own wants or desires or needs or preferences behind itself, and looks to intervene in the world in that heroic manner to alleviate the suffering of living beings. And so for me, the order has been that context for self-sacrifice. It has been a context for self-sacrifice where I can look to live up to this ideal of offering my life up for something bigger than me. Now, of course, that is an ideal, and ideals you fall down on, and sometimes you don't do very well, and sometimes you need to try and do better, and it's always a case of improving that level of commitment and dedication. So it's not a question of sort of doing it or not doing it. It's more that the order as a context is a context, ideally, to serve others. And so often, when we put on retreats, for example, beginners retreats, one of the first things that people say and that they notice about order members is, just sort of how well they interact with each other when they're looking to put on something that goes beyond themselves. And that order members are at their best individually, but also collectively, when they're doing something that looks to spread the message of the Dharma, spread the message of the Buddha, and alleviate the suffering in the world. And I think really the order is really at its best when it's doing this, because I think the myth of self-sacrifice, the myth of heroicism, is right in at the heart of the order, and why Bhante Sangharakshita founded the order as well. So in the order, action is expected of you. Heroicism is expected of you. A private life is no longer good enough. If you're ordained and you go back to a conventional sort of normal private life some few years after you're ordained, your ordination has meant nothing. I'd go as far as to say that your ordination has meant nothing. The ordination, to the extent that it's a vow to serve all living beings, is only enacted, only brought about, only actualized when you live out that vow over a lifetime, or as long as your lifetime you have left. And you look to come back to that ideal moment after moment. And of course, ideals, we all fall down on ideals, don't we? But the hope is always is that you have something at the center of your heart, that right in your guts, that looks up to that ideal and wants to honor and motivate that ideal. So we need heroes. I think heroism is deeply important. I think the myth of the Bodhisattva, of going out into the world for the benefit of all living beings, is very much alive in the order, very much alive in Bhante Sangharakshita's teachings, and the myth that was passed down to us in the order. And I feel deeply privileged to be part of that order. It's something that's of such deep pride for me, and of such benefit to the world when it's at its best, I think. And I'd really, I suppose, invite us to think, well, okay, and many of us don't want to join the order, and that's absolutely fine as well. But I think what it invites us to do, this myth of the Bodhisattva, of going beyond ourselves for the benefit of all living beings, is invite us to do as well, how can I do that? How can I serve and go beyond myself to offer myself up to an ideal that's bigger than me? Because I think we need those ideals, and we need to serve those ideals. And a fully lived human life honors those ideals and has a huge place for those ideals within that life. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you.